The evening was uncharacteristically quiet, the kind of stillness that made you notice the small things you usually didn't. The low hum of the refrigerator, the gentle creak of the floorboards as the house settled, and the faint rustle of leaves brushing against the windows outside. Mark sat in the living room, sipping lukewarm coffee, his eyes darting back and forth between the muted television and the stairs leading to the bedroom. His wife, Laura, had been resting for hours now, ever since the accident. They had been driving back from a weekend getaway in the mountains, a trip meant to rekindle something that had slipped away between them over the years. The narrow, winding roads were treacherous at the best of times, and that night had been no exception. Mark hadn't even seen the deer until it was too late. He swerved, the car spun, and then there was the sickening thud as Laura's head slammed into the passenger window. She had been unconscious for only a few minutes, but when she woke, something wasn't right. At first, it was just the confusion, the dizziness, and the disorientation, all symptoms he thought were normal for a head injury. The doctor at the small-town hospital said she had suffered a concussion, nothing more, and after a brief examination, they were sent home with instructions to let her rest and monitor her closely. Mark had done as instructed, but it didn't take long for him to realize that something far more sinister was happening. It started the first night. Mark had just settled into bed beside Laura, her soft breathing filling the room, when she stirred, mumbling something incoherent in her sleep. He turned to look at her, but she was still, her eyes closed, lips barely moving as she whispered to someone he couldn't see. He reached out, gently shaking her shoulder. "Laura, wake up. You're talking in your sleep." She bolted upright, eyes wide with fear, gasping for breath. "They're here." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. "Who's here?" "The shadows," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're watching me." Mark glanced around the dark room, illuminated only by the soft glow of the moon through the curtains. There was nothing, no one. "It's just a dream," he reassured her, pulling her close. "You're safe. Go back to sleep." But Laura didn't go back to sleep that night. She sat upright, eyes darting to every corner of the room, watching, waiting. She didn't say anything more, but Mark could feel her tension, the way her body trembled slightly as she clung to him. The next morning, she seemed better. Tired, yes, but lucid. She smiled at him, made coffee, and even joked about the previous night's strange dream. Mark thought maybe that was the end of it, that the concussion had caused some temporary confusion and things would return to normal. But that night, it happened again. This time, Laura didn't wait for sleep to speak of the shadows. "They're getting closer," she said softly as they lay in bed, her voice trembling. Mark frowned. "Laura, there's no one here. You're just still recovering from the accident." She shook her head, her eyes wide and glassy, as if she were staring at something he couldn't see. "You don't understand. They're real, Mark. They're in the corners. They're watching. They want something from me." Mark tried to calm her, to convince her it was all in her head. But no matter what he said, it didn't matter. Every night it got worse. She would wake up screaming, thrashing in the bed, begging Mark to make them stop. He would hold her, reassure her, but deep down, a knot of fear was forming in his stomach. What if she wasn't imagining it? What if the head injury had done more damage than the doctors realized? After a week of sleepless nights, Mark took her to a neurologist. The scans came back clear. "There's nothing physically wrong with her," the doctor said, handing Mark the results. "It's possible she's suffering from post-concussion syndrome, but I suggest you consult a psychiatrist. Sometimes trauma can manifest in ways that affect the mind. Mark agreed, though he didn't tell Laura about the referral to the psychiatrist. He knew how she would react. She was always fiercely independent, refusing to believe that anything could be wrong with her mentally. But he was growing desperate. She was getting worse. The nights became unbearable. Laura no longer slept at all, sitting in the bed, rocking back and forth, her eyes wide and bloodshot, murmuring to herself. Mark tried staying up with her, but exhaustion eventually overtook him, and he would drift off only to wake to the sound of her sobbing quietly in the dark. One night, Mark woke to a strange sensation, like something cold and heavy was pressing down on his chest. He opened his eyes and froze. Laura was standing at the foot of the bed, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, staring down at him. Her eyes were vacant, her face pale, almost translucent in the moonlight. "Laura," he whispered, his voice shaking. "They're inside me," she said in a voice that wasn't hers. It was deeper, raspier, like something crawling up from the depths of her throat. "They've been inside me since the accident." Mark's heart raced as he scrambled out of bed, backing away from her. What are you talking about?" She didn't move, didn't blink. "They came with me when I hit my head. They followed me back. Now they want you too." Mark felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he glanced around the room. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, more defined, as if they were pulsing, growing, alive. His breath hitched as he swore he saw something shift within the darkness. A figure, tall and slender, watching him with glowing eyes. Before he could react, Laura collapsed, her body crumpling to the floor like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Mark rushed to her side, his hands trembling as he lifted her limp body. She was cold, her skin clammy, and her breathing was shallow. Panicking, he called an ambulance. By the time they arrived, Laura was awake but disoriented. She didn't remember anything, didn't recall standing at the foot of the bed, didn't remember the words she had spoken in that unnatural voice. She seemed fragile, her body weak, her mind shattered. The doctors kept her overnight for observation, but again, they found nothing physically wrong with her. Mark stayed by her side, refusing to leave, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had followed them home from that mountain road. Something that had slipped into their lives through the crack of Laura's head injury, something that wasn't going to let go. By the time they returned home, Laura was a shell of herself. She barely spoke, barely ate, and spent most of her time staring blankly at the walls. The shadows seemed to cling to her, hovering just at the edge of Mark's vision, like dark stains that wouldn't wash away. And then one night Laura disappeared. She didn't leave a note. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. Mark searched the house, calling her name, but the only answer he received was the hollow echo of his own voice. The house felt heavier, darker, as if the very air was thick with malice. He called the police, but they found nothing. No one had seen her, no cameras had caught her leaving. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Mark was left alone in the house, haunted by the memories of Laura's last days, by the feeling that the shadows in the corners were still watching him, waiting for him to break. And as the nights dragged on, Mark began to hear them, too. The whispers, soft and insistent, coming from the darkness. They called to him, promising that if he just let go, he could be with her again. Mark never turned the lights off after that, but the shadows found him anyway. Laura had been missing for nearly a month, and no amount of pleading with the police, private investigators, or anyone else seemed to make a difference. She had simply vanished. Friends and family tried to console him, offering well-meaning words that bounced off him like rain on stone. They couldn't understand. No one could. Something had taken Laura, and now he feared it was coming for him. The house, once warm and familiar, had become a labyrinth of nightmares. The walls seemed to close in on him, and every creak, every gust of wind that swept through the hallways felt malevolent. But it was the shadows, those creeping, living stains in the corners, that truly terrified him. They were always there, always watching. Mark stopped leaving the house. He couldn't bring himself to go outside. It wasn't just the fear that Laura would return and he wouldn't be there. It was the feeling that whatever had taken her hadn't finished with him. The outside world was a distant memory, and his house had become a fortress of isolation and dread. One evening, after hours of staring at the same wall, Mark noticed something he hadn't seen before: a door. It was in the basement, a place he rarely visited. The house was old, filled with forgotten rooms and hidden spaces, but Mark was certain he had never seen this door before. It was small, almost child-sized, tucked into the far corner behind a stack of old furniture covered in dusty sheets. The door was painted the same color as the basement walls, making it easy to overlook, but now it seemed to call to him, beckoning him to come closer. His heart pounded as he approached. The air around it felt colder, heavier, as if it were saturated with something ancient and wrong. He hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the knob. It was cold, unnaturally cold, and when he turned it, the door creaked open with a low groan that echoed through the basement. On the other side, there was nothing but darkness, a thick, impenetrable void that seemed to swallow the weak beam of the flashlight he had grabbed. Mark's breath quickened as he strained to see into the blackness. For a moment, he considered shutting the door and walking away, but a soft sound stopped him. A whisper, faint and distant, but unmistakable. "Mark!" His blood froze. It was Laura's voice. Without thinking, he stepped through the door, the darkness swallowing him whole. The air was thick, oppressive, and cold, but there was something else. Something alive within the blackness, something that watched him, followed him, breathed with him. As he ventured deeper into the unknown, his footsteps echoed on the unseen floor, each step growing heavier, as though the weight of the shadows themselves clung to him. And then, just ahead, he saw her, Laura. She stood there, her back to him, her figure barely illuminated by the dim beam of his flashlight. Her hair hung limply over her shoulders, her clothes tattered and stained with something dark. Mark's breath hitched as he ran toward her, his mind racing with relief and terror. "Laura!" he called, his voice trembling. "Laura, is that you?" She didn't move. She just stood there, motionless, as though waiting for something. As he drew closer, his heart pounded in his ears. He reached out, desperate to touch her, to pull her back from whatever abyss she had been lost in. But when his hand brushed her shoulder, she turned. Her face was wrong. It was Laura, but it wasn't. Her skin was stretched tight over her skull, her eyes sunken, blackened, and hollow. Her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, her teeth too sharp, too long. But it was her eyes, those dark, endless pits, that chilled him to the core. They weren't human anymore. They were something else. "Mark," she whispered, her voice layered with others. Many others, overlapping and discordant. "I told you, they're inside me, and now, They're inside you too. Before he could react, her hand shot out, cold and clawed, gripping his wrist with unnatural strength. Her touch sent a wave of ice through his veins, and he tried to pull away, but the harder he struggled, the tighter her grip became. "Come with me," she hissed, her voice growing louder, more twisted. "Come with me to where they wait." The shadows around them writhed, growing thicker, darker, until they closed in, suffocating him. Mark gasped for air, his vision blurring as the darkness seemed to seep into his very skin, wrapping around his bones like a parasite. In his final moment of clarity, he broke free, stumbling backward, his heart racing. Laura's form wavered, dissolving into the shadows, her twisted smile the last thing he saw before the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang. Mark fell to the cold basement floor, gasping for breath. His body shook uncontrollably, his mind reeling from the encounter. He scrambled to his feet and threw himself at the door, yanking it open to reveal the basement as it had always been, silent, empty. But as he stood there, panting and drenched in sweat, he knew something had changed. The shadows no longer lurked in the corners of the room. They had moved inside him. The next few days were a blur of confusion and paranoia. Mark could feel it, the presence, the thing Laura had warned him about. It was inside him now, whispering in the back of his mind, gnawing at his sanity. The shadows no longer waited in the corners. They followed him everywhere, twisting and contorting in ways that defied the laws of light and physics. At first, it was subtle, a fleeting glimpse of something out of the corner of his eye, a cold breeze that didn't belong, whispers just on the edge of hearing. But soon it became relentless. They whispered to him, the voices of countless others, echoing through his thoughts. They spoke of the dark place they had come from, a place beyond death, where time didn't exist and where they were trapped, hungry for the light of the living. And as the days passed, Mark began to lose track of time. The lines between night and day blurred, and he found himself standing in front of the small door in the basement again and again, drawn to it like a moth to flame. Each time he would open it, expecting to see the void, to hear Laura's voice calling him back. But the door remained empty, its black maw taunting him. The shadows were patient. They knew he would return. And one night, as Mark stood before the door, his hand trembling on the knob, he heard the voices again. Louder this time, more insistent. But this time, they weren't calling him from the other side of the door. They were inside his head. The darkness was no longer content to lurk in the corners. It was consuming him piece by piece, day by day. Soon, Mark knew there would be nothing left of him. Just another shadow in the corner. Mark's world had shrunk to the space between his ears. The whispers had grown louder, more demanding, filling every moment of his life. Even when he tried to sleep, there was no rest, no escape, only the constant, gnawing sensation that something was crawling beneath his skin. The shadows had become a part of him, their presence inescapable, their voices relentless. "You belong to us now," they whispered. "There's no turning back." Mark had stopped answering his phone, stopped eating, stopped everything. His body felt foreign, heavy, as though it wasn't his anymore. Sometimes he would catch glimpses of himself in the mirror, only to see someone else staring back at him. His reflection had changed. His eyes seemed sunken, hollow, the skin beneath them bruised and gray. His cheeks were gaunt, and his once dark hair was streaked with strands of gray. He was wasting away, being devoured from the inside out. The nights were the worst. The darkness in his house seemed thicker now, alive, shifting and moving just beyond the reach of the lamps he left on. The basement door had become an obsession. Every night, Mark found himself drawn to it, compelled to stand before it, listening to the faint hum of something on the other side. He had started to hear voices in the walls, two soft murmurs that grew louder the closer he got to the door. It was waiting for him, and he knew it. But he wasn't ready to give in, not yet. There was still a sliver of his former self buried deep within him, a tiny flicker of resistance that refused to be extinguished. That part of him clung desperately to the hope that there was a way out of this nightmare, some way to break free from whatever had attached itself to him the night of the accident. One night, after hours of pacing the house, trying to silence the voices in his head, Mark made a decision. He was going to confront the thing on the other side of the door. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one he had left. He couldn't keep living like this, trapped in the twilight between sanity and madness. He had to end it one way or another. He waited until the house was completely still, the shadows pressing in around him like a suffocating blanket. The basement door loomed in front of him, and for the first time in weeks, Mark felt something close to resolve. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and reached for the cold brass knob. The door opened with a soft creak, and beyond it, the void awaited him. Mark stepped through, flashlight in hand, and descended the narrow staircase into the abyss. The darkness was thicker than before, as though the air itself had weight. It was like stepping into another world, a place where light didn't belong. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, and his heart pounded in his chest. But still, he pressed on, deeper into the blackness, until the door behind him was just a faint memory. As he walked, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They no longer murmured incoherently in the distance. Now they spoke to him directly, calling his name, urging him to keep going, to come closer. "Mark, we've been waiting for you." His flashlight flickered, casting weak beams that barely penetrated the gloom. Every now and then, he would catch sight of something moving just beyond the edge of the light, figures shifting and twisting in the shadows. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to ignore them. They couldn't touch him, not yet. The ground beneath his feet changed as he continued deeper into the void. What had once been solid concrete was now soft, spongy, as though he were walking on damp earth. A foul stench filled the air, thick and cloying, like the smell of rot and decay. Mark gagged, covering his mouth with his sleeve, but the smell clung to him, crawling into his nostrils, making him dizzy. Suddenly, his foot caught on something, and he stumbled forward, barely managing to keep his balance. He shined the flashlight down, and his stomach twisted. It was a hand, pale and lifeless. The hand jutted out from the ground, the fingers curled into a grotesque claw. Mark recoiled, stepping back, his mind racing. How long had it been there? How many others were buried beneath his feet, waiting to be found? The flashlight flickered again, and in the brief flashes of light, Mark saw them. Countless bodies, twisted and contorted, half buried in the soft earth beneath him. Their faces were gaunt, hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. Some were missing limbs, others were barely more than skeletons, but all of them had the same empty, soulless eyes. Mark's heart raced, his mind reeling. He turned to run, but the ground shifted beneath him, pulling him down. The earth was alive, sucking at his feet, dragging him closer to the bodies. He struggled, panic surging through him, But the more he fought, the tighter the earth's grip became. And then he heard it, her voice. Mark! It was Laura. Her voice was soft, almost soothing, cutting through the chaos around him. He stopped struggling, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he scanned the darkness, searching for her. Laura, he called, his voice trembling. Mark, I'm here. Come to me. Her voice was closer now, just ahead, beyond the bodies and the twisted earth. Mark felt an inexplicable pull, a compulsion to find her, to follow her voice. His legs moved on their own, dragging him deeper into the darkness, away from the light of his fading flashlight. As he walked, the whispers around him grew louder, more insistent, but he ignored them. Laura was all that mattered now. Finally, he saw her, standing in the distance, her back to him, just as she had been the first time he saw her in the void. Her figure was shrouded in shadows, but he knew it was her. He could feel it. Laura! He shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. I'm here. She didn't move, didn't turn to look at him. Mark's chest tightened as he stumbled forward, reaching out for her. The ground beneath him shifted and twisted, but he ignored it. He had to reach her. He had to bring her back. But as he closed the distance between them, something changed. The shadows around Laura began to writhe and pulse, growing darker, more solid. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as the air grew thick with the stench of decay. His steps faltered, but he pressed on. Laura! She turned. The thing that stood before him wasn't Laura. It was wearing her face, her body, but it was wrong. Twisted and broken, its eyes black and soulless, its mouth hanging open in a grotesque grin. The shadows that clung to it were alive, writhing like a mass of serpents, twisting and curling around its body. Mark! It hissed, its voice layered with hundreds of others. You're too late. Before he could react, the thing lunged at him, its cold, clawed hands wrapping around his throat. Mark gasped, choking as the air was ripped from his lungs. The shadows closed in around him, suffocating him, pulling him down into the earth. And then, everything went black. When Mark opened his eyes, he was lying in his bed. The room was still, the early morning light filtering through the curtains. His heart raced as he sat up, gasping for breath, his mind spinning. It had been a dream, a horrible, twisted nightmare. But as his hands touched his throat, he felt the bruises, dark, finger-shaped marks that circled his neck. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted. They were still with him. They had always been with him. And now they were never going to leave. Mark lay frozen in his bed, his trembling fingers tracing the bruises on his neck. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, and his heart pounded in his chest as if trying to break free. He glanced around the room, his eyes darting to every shadowed corner, every place where the darkness gathered thick and deep. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a profound silence that weighed heavy on his mind. It was the silence before the storm. He knew it wasn't over. The dream, the basement, Laura, none of it had been a mere nightmare. He could still feel their presence, lurking just beyond the edges of reality, waiting for him to let his guard down. The shadows had claimed him, and no amount of denial could change that. He stumbled out of bed, his legs weak beneath him, and made his way to the bathroom. The mirror above the sink reflected back a face he barely recognized. Pale, gaunt, eyes hollow and bloodshot. The bruises on his neck stood out in stark contrast against his pale skin. He reached up to touch them, and as his fingers made contact, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The marks weren't fading. They were getting darker. Mark's reflection wavered in the mirror, as if the glass itself were distorting. He blinked, his heart skipping a beat, and leaned closer. The image in the mirror no longer moved with him. His reflection stood still, staring back at him with empty, black eyes. A cruel smile twisted its lips, and as Mark recoiled in horror, the reflection spoke. "You're already dead," it whispered, the voice low and guttural, not his own. Mark's stomach twisted in fear. He stumbled backward, away from the mirror, but the reflection didn't vanish. It stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass as though trying to push through. The smile grew wider, grotesque, stretching across its face in a way that shouldn't have been possible. "We've been inside you all along," the reflection continued, its voice layered with hundreds of others. Laura's, the whispers, the voices from the basement. "There's no escaping us, Mark. You're ours." The room around him seemed to darken, the air growing thick with an oppressive weight. Mark backed out of the bathroom, his heart racing, but the shadows followed him. They clung to his every step, whispering, shifting, growing larger, more defined. He could feel them closing in, wrapping around him like a living thing. Panic surged through him and he ran, down the stairs, through the hallway, desperate to escape the suffocating presence. But no matter how fast he ran, the shadows stayed with him. The walls seemed to twist and warp as he moved, the house no longer the familiar place it had once been. Every corner was filled with creeping darkness, every shadow alive with malice. He reached the front door and yanked it open, only to be met with a wall of black. The outside world was gone, replaced by an endless void that pulsed and shifted like a living thing. The air was cold, so cold it burned his skin, and the whispers, the ones he had thought were gone, returned in full force, swirling around him in a cacophony of voices. "Mark, come with us. Join us. Let go." He slammed the door shut, backing away as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. His mind was unraveling, the fragile barrier between reality and whatever this nightmare was breaking down piece by piece. He turned, his breath hitching in his throat, and ran toward the basement. He didn't know why, didn't know what he was hoping to find there, but something deep inside him told him that whatever had started this was down there, waiting for him. The small, child-sized door beckoned to him, just as it had that first night. It was open now, the darkness beyond it deeper than ever, a living, breathing thing that called his name. Mark stood at the threshold, his hands shaking. He had no choice. There was no escape from this. The shadows would follow him no matter where he went. They had already consumed Laura. They were already consuming him. With one last, ragged breath, he stepped through the door. The darkness swallowed him whole. The basement was no longer a basement. The walls stretched impossibly high, the ground beneath his feet soft and wet like freshly turned soil. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and the whispers were all around him now, loud and overwhelming. Figures moved in the darkness, twisted, malformed bodies that writhed and shifted like they were struggling to free themselves from the earth. And at the center of it all stood Laura. She was waiting for him, her body still as a statue, her face hidden in the shadows. But Mark knew it was her, he could feel it. The thing that had taken her, the thing that had been pulling him deeper and deeper into this nightmare, was finally revealing itself. "Laura," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. She stepped forward, the shadows parting around her like a curtain. But it wasn't Laura. Not anymore. Her face was twisted, her skin pale and stretched thin over her bones. Her eyes were black, hollow pits that seemed to absorb the light around them. She smiled, her teeth sharp and gleaming. "You were always going to join us," she said, her voice layered with the voices of the others. "You can't fight it, Mark. You belong to the darkness now." The ground beneath his feet began to tremble, and the bodies buried in the soil started to rise. One by one, they pulled themselves free, their eyes empty, their mouths open in silent screams. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he realized what they were. They were him, hundreds of versions of himself, twisted and broken, all staring back at him with the same hollow eyes, the same bruises on their necks. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been here before. He had never escaped. The shadows closed in around him, and Mark fell to his knees, his mind fracturing under the weight of the truth. There was no escape. There had never been any escape. The darkness had claimed him long ago, and everything since had been an illusion, a cruel game played by the shadows. Laura's twisted form knelt in front of him, her cold, lifeless hand reaching out to touch his face. "Shoo," she whispered, her voice soft now, almost tender. "It's over, Mark. Let go." Mark's breath hitched in his throat as the darkness wrapped around him, pulling him down into the earth. He didn't fight it. He couldn't. The whispers were inside him now, soothing him, promising an end to the pain, to the fear. He closed his eyes, letting the cold embrace of the shadows take him. And as the last of his consciousness faded, he heard the voices one final time, soft and sweet. "Welcome home." The shadows swallowed him whole. And then there was nothing. The house was silent once more, its corners filled with nothing but darkness. Outside, the world continued on, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. But in the shadows, the whispers waited. They always waited, for the next soul to stumble into their embrace.